Hello, I'm Annette Young, filling in for Francois Picard on The World this week in partnership with The Daily Beast, the show where four journalists chew the fat on what's been making headlines in the last 7 days. With me tonight is Christopher Dickey, foreign editor at The Daily Beast, also Alyssa Rubin, a journalist with The New York Times, Sophie Giannini, a French freelance journalist and author, and Jose Manuel Lamarck, a senior correspondent with France Inter Radio. So thanks to all of you for coming in. So, after weeks and weeks of speculation, on Monday we finally got a taste of what Robert Mueller's FBI investigation into possible collusion between Moscow and the Trump presidential campaign has indeed been up to. Firstly, there was the revelation that a former Trump foreign policy advisor, George Papadopoulos, was informed in April last year by a Russian contact that Moscow had indeed obtained thousands of emails containing dirt on Hillary Clinton, having made the question of collusion that much more urgent. This as former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort turned himself into federal authorities to face charges including conspiracy, tax evasion and money laundering. Christopher Dickey, this is still the beginning of a very long process, isn't it?
Oh, yes, but we can see that Mueller is going to be turning the screws on a lot of people, certainly on the people we just talked about. Manafort and his associate Gates, they're going to hang, basically. The charges against them for money laundering and all kinds of offenses, they're allegations, of course, but they're very, very detailed, and they're going to have a lot of trouble getting out of those charges, which is exactly what Mueller wants, because he wants to tighten the screws on them and make them talk, in fact, about collusion with Russia, whatever they knew about it, and they were in the best position to know about it. But the real revelations were with Papadopoulos, this relatively minor advisor to the Trump campaign, who in fact was in a key position to know where, as we say, a lot of the bodies were buried and a lot of the dirt is. And he apparently has been cooperating with the investigation. And there's a lot of speculation that he was, as we say, wearing a wire, recording conversations. So yeah, it's going to be a long process, and I think it's going to be one that has a lot of revelations.
Alyssa, the stakes for Donald Trump and the country could not be higher.
Well, I certainly think that's true. There's one small problem, which is that the country doesn't seem to take this quite as seriously, and the people who support him don't take it quite as much to heart as many in Washington do, although there has been a sort of steady erosion of his support in the polls, and it seems this week that there was quite a bit of support for Mueller's tactics and what he's come up with. I think the fact that there have been pretty clear examples of Trump and also Jeff Sessions today, it was made very clear, of lying blatantly. It's taking a toll on a person, on a leader who had previously has somehow managed to seem to have a bit of Teflon in his presentation.
Jose Manuel, as soon as the word got out on Monday, the knives were also very much sharpened when it came to Robert Mueller. I mean, all of a sudden we started to hear about, how long could he last in the job?
We don't know how long could he last in the job. The first thing I see is, and I note, is the man who came in from the cold. There's always a kind of subject like Clinton or Trump in the United States with Moscow. That never happens with Moscow, It's like a tropism for the United States. Who is the spy? What does Moscow? Always the same thing, I don't know how it'll last, but I think that it's a little bit quite more heroic for the United States. I do remember that the case, if you remember, in the 80s, the case of the Russian embassy in Washington, was the same. The Russian embassy was up at the White House. Of course, they were spying United States. It's always a real ghost, a Russian ghost in the White House. That's what I note over this case.
Sophie, watching this from the other side of the Atlantic, I mean, there is a chance that Donald Trump could be charged, but the reality is he still at this moment has the support of the Republicans. And if there was any move to impeach him, the odds are that the Republicans in the Congress would make it very hard for that to actually occur.
Well, I don't feel like it's the first time that we have the impression that something is on the verge to happen and that maybe we could, I don't want to use the expression get rid of, it wouldn't be appropriate, but maybe...
Oh, yes, it would.
Yeah? Okay. Thank you.
It's Friday evening. All bets are off, Sophie.
Great. So we had this impression several times, and there is always, like every week brings a new accusation. I've heard also about psychologists signing a paper saying that he's not fit even to be on the job. To be honest, like, I don't know what is going to actually make something happen, but it's a bit difficult to know if this is the case.
In
right
fact,
now.
what doesn't work in the United States in the White House? Is it with Trump or not Trump? We got always the kind of problem, you know, in the American policy like that, you know, always a kind of problem like this.
Jose Manuel, I don't think we can compare Trump to practically any other president we've had in living memory. Your living memory or mine.
With you, of course.
I don't think he's just sort of like business as usual. In fact, that's the whole thing. In fact, the people who really love him because it's not business as usual. And I don't think we're going to get rid of him anytime soon. We're certainly not going to get rid of him as long as the stock market continues to set records, as long as unemployment is going down, as long as the Republicans are getting their absolute key agenda pushed through, which is tax reform, huge reduction in taxes for the rich and for their base. And as long as people idolize Trump in his core, they love him.
As long as there is a majority and a significant majority in the House that's Republican, and
the House of Representatives,
House of Representatives, and in the Senate, I think because ultimately they are the ones who would, in any impeachment scenario, have to make that vote. And I think that's a very, very hard vote for Republicans to take at this juncture. What happens after November next year is another matter.
Jose Manuel, he couldn't pick a better time to head off to perhaps one of the longest trips ever made by an American leader to Asia, the other end of the world.
Yeah. And so what? And so what? As you said, you've spoken about impeachment. That could happen, yes or not.
Not going to happen.
Never happen. So we'll go along like this for 3 years more. It's a little bit dramatic now.
He's very good at avoiding, though. So
always avoiding, but always getting a problem.
Well, he's always changing the subject, and in fact, the media is always letting him change the subject. We jump on tweets, we jump on one thing after another. He points to that shiny object over there, we run toward it. It's amazing to see how the media is manipulated by Trump, and very successfully. He is, at the beginning of the day and the end of the day, he's a showman. He's a television personality. He's a reality TV star. And he's running the country as if it were a reality TV show with relative success. As long as the economy is in good shape, and it looks like it is in pretty good shape, largely thanks to his predecessor.
You're right.
Then he is going to be invulnerable.
Chris, still the charges against Manafort didn't actually mention any attempted manipulation of the 2016 election, did they?
Well, yeah, but there's a confusion here. There is no question that the Russians tried to manipulate the elections in 2016. About that, there is no question, except when Trump speaks. And it's one of the most damning things that he does, because all of his intelligence apparatus, the people that he's counting on to fight wars against ISIS, to bring him intelligence about terrorism, to bring him intelligence about everything else, that whole intelligence apparatus says to him, the Russians screwed our elections every which way from Sunday. And he says, I don't believe it. I don't think it's fake news. It's phony. Why would he say that unless he felt directly threatened by that information? And maybe it's just his ego that he feels threatened, or maybe he feels threatened because he knows, in fact, that there was collusion. We don't know, but we will find out.
OK, well, moving on, and once again, Manhattan was rocked this week with another act of terrorism. 8 people having died and at least 11 others been injured and been treated at a hospital after the driver of a pickup truck crushed pedestrians in a bike lane in Lower Manhattan. 5 friends from Argentina celebrating the 30th anniversary of their high school graduation were among those killed. This as clues have emerged showing the radicalisation of the suspect, Saifullo Saipov, also an Uber driver. Chris, it was the turn of the Americans this week to learn about Uzbekistan.
And I don't think they learned very much about Uzbekistan. I think the important thing to understand is that this guy was not that this guy was an Uzbek. It is that this guy was radicalized in the United States by remote control. He essentially picked up the how-to manual, the do-it-yourself manual for terrorism that has been put out by the so-called Islamic State. And it's on the web. We've looked at it. Lots of people have looked at it. And he followed it to the letter. It's not like he even used any imagination. He got the kind of truck they suggested. He found the kind of target they suggested. He did the timing they suggested. Everything. Turned it into a mower, they said, in the ISIS manual. And that's exactly what he did.
Alyssa, President Donald Trump warned in the last few hours that the Islamic State group will continue to pay a big price after claiming responsibility for this attack. But there are some in Twitter sphere who are asking, where was the same energetic response when the Las Vegas shooting happened?
Well, I think that's certainly was something that occurred to many people. He had President Trump had a very quick remedy, which was to end the visa lottery program for immigration, which is something which has brought many talented people to the United States, and people think very highly of many aspects of it. But there was not really a call for a change in legislation after the Las Vegas killer went to the 32nd floor and fired, sequences of shots with an unprecedentedly strong or sort of refurbished or carefully furbished weapon. And I think that one can't help but notice that. There's an element of, when it's the other, when it's seen as someone who's Muslim, who's not white, who's a stranger, it's very easy to make those condemnations. But I think most people feel that these, and we saw this in Nice, we've seen it in Germany. These are attacks that are hard to defend against in a society where you want to have a sense of freedom. And so how much do you compromise?
And Sophie, talking about that, because France obviously having experienced those attacks, I mean, this is the thing, this is part of modern day life, isn't it? It sadly has become.
It is for anyone who has friends, relatives abroad, whether it's in Europe or in the US or wherever. You always turn on your phone in the morning with the fear that you're going to have to text someone and say, are you okay? It was highly shocking to me, and I think to all of us the first time that it happened. But then all of a sudden it's starting to become a thing, and it's just part of our daily lives.
Mm. And that's what happened to me. I got called my daughter because I didn't know if she was in Montreal or New York. I sent directly a Viber to know, where are you? What's happening?
And it's also, Christopher, that we look at the statistics, the figures of those who lost their lives. I mean, the lower it is, the less importance it seems to...
well, it has to do with location, too, that it took place in Lower Manhattan, not far from the ground zero in 9/11. That's all very important. And that was carefully calculated, I'm sure, by the terrorist who carried out that attack. On the question of Las Vegas versus this Manhattan atrocity, there were a hell of a lot more people killed in Las Vegas at the beginning of the month. This was at the end of the month, 4 weeks, and yet Las Vegas has largely been forgotten. Now, it was by far the worst terrorist atrocity besides 9/11 that we've ever seen. And people don't inform themselves. For instance, this visa thing, I wrote a piece about the diversity visa. In 1997, what would have been the worst terrorist attack America had ever seen, a plot by two men to do suicide bombing on the B train from Brooklyn into Manhattan, was stopped by a guy who happened to be in the same flop house with these people, who was in the United States on a diversity visa.
Yeah, but
So we'll just forget about that.
Yeah, it's just...
Because Trump built his whole political momentum on terrorism. Trump became president on the back of the murdered people here in Paris.
He's not the only one.
Murdered people in San Bernardino.
And we're going to have to move on, because sticking with terrorism, France this week, having lifted its state of emergency for the first time since those horrific November 13 attacks in 2015, It's been replaced with tough new anti-terrorism laws that grants police and investigators extensive powers to raid, detain and question terrorism suspects, making many special provisions permanent. This is what President Emmanuel Macron had to say earlier this week.
We spoke about the fight against terrorism, which must be fought with constant respect for basic and fundamental freedoms guaranteed by the European Convention on Human Rights. It is in this respect that we have decided to end from Wednesday the state of emergency which went into place following the attacks in November 2015.
Sophie, as a French national, I want to ask you once again the debate raging on that fine line between ensuring safety for all citizens, but at the same time treading very much on civil liberties.
Civil liberties, civil freedom, civil rights. I just think that there is a problem when a lot of alarms are ringing, when you get informations like warnings from even UN reporter saying that this type of law is actually depriving citizens from their freedom, and by doing that encouraging some kind of violence that could lead to more terrorism, because the first people who will be in trouble because of this new law are Muslim, just like we were talking about in the US. So they will be targeted, they will be the first one to be checked by the police on a regular basis for no reason, and they will be the one encouraged to, get radicalized again. So I don't think that going from a state of emergency that is supposed to be made to be on a short-term thing, to go to making the common law something about restriction of civilian freedom isn't a good thing.
Christopher Dickey, very quickly, I mean, one of the parts of this new law is the creation of a new anti-terrorism task force. One thing that emerged during that horrific night and the subsequent terrorist attacks afterwards is the fact the left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing in France.
Well, this is always a problem, that you've got different intelligence apparatuses that sometimes talk to each other and sometimes don't. And in a moment of crisis, when they're all supposed to come together, they don't do a great job, but they have to come together long before the moment of crisis to keep it from happening. That's the whole point. Whether you have a state of emergency or you have the new anti-terror law, it all has to be oriented toward preventing terrorism, not prosecuting people after the fact. And that's a very hard thing to do.
Yes, but preventing terrorism, we do have to remember that 10 years ago, the former governments, they cut in the budget of the army, of the police and the gendarmerie. They are very weak now, and now we have to put a lot of money for these forces, plus the intelligence. We have 2, 3, 4 intelligence services in France, and we have to fill their budget much more than it is, because it's very important for our security now.
At this point, I'm afraid we're going to have to just hit the pause button. We'll be back after a short break with the second part of The World This Week. Do stay with us.
What do you want from your news website? France24.com, giving you easier access to information and faster for a unique experience. France24.com, the international news website.
Reporters, presented by Mark Owen.
Villages pillaged and plundered, homes burned to the ground, people tortured and murdered, forced exodus to neighboring Bangladesh. Such has been the plight of the Rohingya in Myanmar for months. Denied citizenship by the government, the Rohingya minority had great hopes in Aung San Suu Kyi's election, but she's done nothing to stop ethnic cleansing. Don't miss this exclusive France 24 report to meet this Muslim ethnic minority.
Reporters on France 24 and France24.com.
Welcome back. Let's take a look at what's making news this hour. And a Spanish judge is still deliberating on whether to issue an international arrest warrant for Catalonia's ousted leader. This a day after she imprisoned 9 former members of the region's separatist government. Also, in a major blow to the jihadist organisation, the Syrian army has retaken Deir al-Zur, the last major stronghold of the Islamic State group in Syria. And French prosecutors are to appeal the verdict in a homegrown jihadist terror trial, Abdelkader Marar being found guilty of terror offences but cleared of having a direct role in his brother's 2012 attacks that left 7 people dead. And Donald Trump set to begin a 12-day tour of Asia, the US president focusing on the nuclear threat from North Korea, but questions on trade and cooperation also being on the agenda. Hello and welcome back. I'm Annette Young, filling in for Francois Picard, who's on a much-needed vacation, and I'm here to host The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast, the show where 4 journalists chew the fat on what's been making headlines in the last 7 days. With me tonight is Christopher Dickey, a foreign editor at The Daily Beast, also Elisa Rubin, a journalist with The New York Times, Sophie Giannini, a French freelance journalist and author, and José Manuel Lamarck, a senior correspondent with France Inter Radio. And thousands of Catalans once took to the streets again, protesting against the detention of a number of regional ministers sacked over Catalonia's push for independence from Spain. The officials been accused of rebellion, sedition and misuse of public funds. Prosecutors are also seeking a European arrest warrant for the ousted Catalan leader, Carles Puigdemont, who did not show up in court and is now in Brussels. And this is what he had to say.
As the president of the legitimate government of Catalonia, elected in the polls on September 27th, I demand the release of the members of my cabinet and of the vice president. I demand the respect of all political opinions, and I demand the end of political repression. This act is against the elections of December 21st that will take place in a climate of repression and political imprisonment without precedent, and that is unacceptable to a democratic Europe in the 21st century.
José Manuel, this story has had so many twists and turns. What do you think is actually going to happen to Puigdemont?
For Carles Puigdemont, I think that he will stay in Brussels, of course. He won't go back to Barcelona or Madrid. It's no more a Catalan problem, it's a Spanish problem. Because we see the most stupid government of Europe. Nicola Sturgeon, the Prime Minister of Scotland, she said that it's incredible now to see a country, a state, to put in jail 4 politicians, 4 Catalan politicians. In this real state of Spain, where many politicians from the party of Rajoy are corrupted because the PP, the Conservative Party, is the most corrupted party in Spain. It's like a real stupidity. And second point, now Rajoy shows that there's no autonomy for the province in Spain, because if you don't follow Madrid, you're no more an autonomy for your province. That's reality. And I think we go back to the time of Franco, because the Partido Popular, which is the Conservative Party, directly comes from the Franco time now. And I think it's no more a Catalan problem. It's a Spanish problem. They have to rebuild a constitution, and they have to face reality. They refused in Spain for 40 years a Spanish debate about the Second Republic, the Civil War, and the time of the dictatorship. And when you forgot, you passed comes on reality.
I was in Andalusia the week before last, and it's an area of Spain I know well. And one thing that struck me was the number of Spanish flags that were flying left, right and centre, something which I had not seen before. It's certainly leading to a rise in nationalism, isn't it?
It is. And before, we do remember when Rajoy sent the Guardia Civil to Barcelona. Just watch what happened in many in many towns in Spain. When the Guardia Civil went to Barcelona, they were supported by people, like for war, kill the Catalans, you know. And Rajoy used the same practice of Franco. You know, you're paid to go to a demonstration with a flag, and you organize a lot of buses from all Spain for the demonstrations. That did Franco too. My question is, over Puigdemont, that the president of the Basque Land, the Lehendakari, didn't say a word. Didn't say a word.
And why was that?
And I'd like to know why. And the church, for 1 month, no word from the Spanish church, which is powerful, you know, because Madame Santa Maria, who has to lead Catalonia now, she is from the extreme conservative part of the Spanish church. Many questions. I think that it's over Puigdemont.
Christopher, it's not going to be easy for Madrid to regain control of Catalonia, is it?
Well, no, and especially not if it continues to make martyrs. I think that about 30 seconds worth of video from October 1st, the elections that they tried to stop, of heads being beaten and an old lady with blood pouring down her face and people being pushed downstairs, that video was absolutely disastrous for Madrid, and I'm not sure that that Rajoy understood how bad that was, partly because there is a nationalist upsurge in other parts of Spain, in Andalusia, in Madrid, in other parts of the country, and the Basques are remaining very quiet. And the fact is there isn't that much sympathy for the Catalans in the rest of the country, because one of the things that José Manuel isn't talking about is how also corrupt the Catalans are and how incredibly arrogant they are. You know, the Catalans systematically have said they are a different ethnicity. It's not just the language. They are a different ethnicity. We are richer, and the subtext
and
is we are whiter than you are. It is an ugly fight, and it's going to be very hard to control. But when you listen to what the Catalans say about freedom, about liberty, the question is, what were the liberties they didn't have? Was it that they were not able to speak their language? Yeah, they were able to speak their language, to teach it. In fact, you couldn't teach Spanish as much as you could teach Catalan. These are not the Kurds. These are not people who have been systematically repressed. These are people who've had an extremely high degree of autonomy and now want more. That's a very different situation, and it's very much like you see in northern Italy. Frankly, I wrote a book about the American Civil War. It's like you saw in the American South. Very rich people who are driving the train because they see their own benefit in secession, and they don't really care what it does to the overall country.
It doesn't go down well with regions like Andalusia, which are poorer, and a feeling that, if anything, you know, the Catalans are taking more than their fair share of the wealth. But, Alyssa, how much do you think events in Catalonia are now fueling other independence movements elsewhere in Europe?
Well, I don't know how much they will fuel events elsewhere in Europe. I know that they were watched very closely in Kurdistan during that referendum, because I was there in Kurdistan and talked with a number of Europeans, all of whom said, we'd like to support the Kurds, but we really can't right now because the Catalonian referendum was coming up a week later. And so I do think it reverberates. But, you know, it hasn't been entirely successful, and I don't think that Puigdemont was able to articulate a message that talked much about what an independent Catalonia would look like. And so you have they're saying they're different from Spain and they want their own identity. They certainly have their own language. But I think what Chris said is spot on, that it's very hard to see what they were missing. What did they want that they didn't have? I think it's much easier to understand what the Kurds were worrying about that they didn't have.
Sophie, here in France, you know, we always look towards the Bretons and other elements of the country, the Basques even.
Corsica.
Alsace-Lorraine. Exactly, it goes on. Do you think that it's fueling independence sentiment in those parts of the country?
I don't think so, no. I think those...
It's impossible.
It's not impossible. It's not the same thing, though, because as we were discussing, Catalonia, in my opinion, is mostly about the fact that Europe and the world at the moment is living a crisis, and when you're in time of crisis, you just want to protect what's yours, and Catalonia is a very rich area of Spain, making more money than the rest of the country, and they just want to protect what's theirs, and they're tired, as they say, to pay for the rest of the country. We don't have this situation in Corsica. If anything else, it's quite the other way around. Corsica is depending on the country quite a lot. It's the same thing for Brittany. It's not the same, but neither of those places you mentioned are in a position where they can say that they are earning more and that they are above the rest of the country and that they should break apart from it for this reason. So it's not comparable.
I think it's impossible because the two older states in Europe are France and United Kingdom. You know, by François Ier, they decided a lot of things to create their state. And after the French Revolution, the French decided to get a nation, and the nation was the citizens, and the citizens are the nation, which are two concepts very, very strong for France. It's not the case for Spain.
And Spain is a relatively young democracy. I mean, it's
very young.
It's
very young.
40 years old. But do you think there's any possibility of compromise? Because what you do see is growing polarisation between the two parties.
I think now it's a real divorce, because it has been a fight between Madrid and Barcelona for years and years, you know, and maybe before the Civil War too. Because in fact, Catalonia was in the Kingdom of Aragon, and suddenly it was invaded by Spain. And I think that's why the Catalans, they try and they want to be independent. You know, they want to recover their independency. It's a very old problem for Spain. But I do repeat, Spain is not France. France is a very powerful state like United Kingdom.
Belgium is the place that would be in trouble. There you've got a real divide between the Flemish-speaking part of Belgium and the French-speaking part, and the Flemish-speaking part is much more prosperous and really doesn't want to pay for the French-speaking part anymore. That's an area where you've got problems. Italy is a place where you've got real problems. And again, rich parts of northern Italy don't want to pay for southern Italy. It's what you might call the Andalusia problem again and again and again. You enjoy Andalusia, I enjoy the Mezzogiorno, but the people up north, they don't want to pay for those places. And they say, we're not going to do it anymore.
And at the same time, Europe keeps its distance in all this, very much saying it's it's an eternal matter. And this despite the fact that Puigdemont is now sort of residing in Brussels.
Well, in Brussels, and no accident, he was invited by the Flemish-speaking Belgians.
Yes, of course. And maybe in Puigdemont's mind, maybe he has some sense of de Gaulle going to Brussels and maybe creating a radio, Catalans to Catalonia, speak from Brussels to you.
Do you think the Free Catalonian Air Force is about to be created? Jose Manuel, but Madrid does have some rather powerful economic levers. I mean, Catalonia owes something about, what, 52 billion euros in debt to the central Spanish government?
Yes, like in old Spain, you know. The fact for me is not a Catalan problem, it's a Spanish problem. There's a wonderful book in Spanish, not translated, explaining the 30 years of the craziness in Spain after democracy. They didn't want to debate, they didn't want to see the past, and they were running into money, craziness, la movida, sex, drinking, everything.
From la movida to la mordida, right?
La mordida y la mordida, claro. And now their reality is the most corrupted country in Europe, and they got so many problems because they were crazy. They were crazy. For 30 years, many towns in Spain, they wanted their stadium, their house of music, blah, 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 blah. You have one airport in Madrid that doesn't work because there's no need of a second airport. I do remember 10 years ago in Catalonia, the town of Lleida in Catalan, they called me to inaugurate the airport of Lleida. I say, what? international airports in Madrid for what? Because you got Barcelona. It was a real craziness for 30 years, and now they pay their own craziness.
OK, now finally, it's a story that keeps on giving. Sexual harassment in the workplace. First it was Hollywood, and now it's the turn of British politics. Michael Fallon being forced to quit as Defence Secretary after a cabinet colleague, Andrea Leadsom, accused him of making lewd remarks some years back. According to British newspapers, Leadsom remarked to Sir Michael, who was then Deputy Chair of the Conservative Party, that she had cold hands. And he allegedly replied, "I know where you can put them to warm them up." Sir Michael saying his general conduct fell short of expected standards and has categorically denied the allegations. And this is what Andrea Leadsom had to say in Parliament as a result.
It is absolutely right that the House must address the urgent issue of alleged mistreatment of staff by members of Parliament. It is a right, not a privilege, to work in a safe and respectful environment. These plans will ensure that Parliament takes a zero-tolerance approach. Parliament must take action in days, not weeks.
Now, Fallon is the first minister to resign since allegations of inappropriate behaviour by MPs from different parties first surfaced some 10 days ago. Alyssa, it does seem the tide is turning. We are witnessing a sea change, if you like, in across a number of sectors where women are saying enough is enough.
Well, I guess I'm a bit of a pessimist. I think that, yes, there's a lot of people coming out and speaking about it. The conversation is more robust than we've ever seen it. But I think if we think back in France to Dominique Strauss-Kahn and the outpouring after that, and then ask ourselves how much laws changed and practices in corporations or in businesses or in smaller workplaces, we will find that many of those women are those complaining today. This is something so deeply entrenched in society. Now, that's not to say that it isn't important to have people speak out, because one thing is that if people begin to worry more that they won't be able to keep their jobs because they're going to be outed by someone, maybe then they will seek help if there's someone who's in need of help, or they will restrain themselves if they can do that. But just the pervasiveness of the number of cases we see attested to on the internet in all of these different Me Too campaigns and different ones in the United States, the one here, it really feels as if this is quite a widespread problem, and it's not going to be quickly remedied. When you say it seems it's quite a widespread problem, I would say every woman would say it is a widespread problem, because we've all experienced it at some point in our lives and in our careers. Chris, let me just ask you, though, there's one interesting fallout of all this, which is the dramatic impact it could have on British politics. I mean, there's a talk of a blacklist of some 30 Conservative MPs floating about in Westminster.
Yes, but that particular, the Sleaze list, as it's called, is full of errors, really egregious errors, where people are living with their partners and they're being accused of harassing them, and all kinds of crazy things. There are probably some legitimate cases to be made, but that's the kind of thing that ultimately undermines the argument for against this kind of abuse. And I'm very pessimistic about it changing over the long run. My experience over the years has been to see these questions come up and be addressed really intensely. And I got two words for you: Clarence Thomas. That was the first time in my adult life that we really saw a huge issue about this. A man nominated for the Supreme Court of the United States, a woman comes forward and talks about exactly what we're talking about, him showing her pornographic images, asking her what she thought of them, and so on. Well, he was not only nominated for the Supreme Court, he was confirmed by the U.S. Senate for the Supreme Court, and he is sitting on the Supreme Court to this day.
But there is one big difference between that time and now, and it's called social media. Sophie, let's talk about that, because you've written a book about all this, and it's called Not Seen, Not Known. And one thing which is really interesting is the difference in which the Anglo-American culture has dealt with it in terms of hashtags, hashtag me too. But here in France, it's balance ton porc, squeal on your pig, which means a culture of denunciation. It's not really sort of a warm and cosy sisterhood feel about it.
All right, I will stop you right there. I am not going to comment on how many of the MPs on the Sleaze list were actually guilty. I'm not going to comment about the denunciation system. Is it a good thing? Is it comfy or not? I'm only going to comment on the fact that what appears to me to be happening right now is that what yesterday was okay isn't gonna be anymore. And all right, call me an optimistic and tell me I'm wrong and tell me that you've heard so many stories before. But as you said, there are social medias nowadays, and the word is spreading, and it's spreading fast and strong. And women are, allied nowadays, and they don't want those things to happen anymore because we're all tired of it, ultimately. So,
I mean, I want to come back to what Alyssa said, because I think it's very interesting, having someone of a younger generation and someone of an older generation. But I think there's one thing about this. Being the host of 51%, I interviewed a few years ago a feminist who said, don't underestimate the anger that young women have. And that the fact that the sheer numbers of women now entering the workforce means that the demographics are changing, that there is a tipping point. You, however, Alyssa, don't think we're coming anywhere close to that tipping point.
Well, I just would like to see that translated into laws and policies and not just into discussions. I agree. I think absolutely women are talking more about it. And that's a really important step. And if it's sustained over time, it will have even more impact. But ultimately, you do have to change practice so that it is simply not tolerated. And I am waiting to see with great interest whether that will happen. In France, I've just been looking into it some of those protections which were in the old under the old Code du Travail, which is being reformed, were jettisoned. They weren't jettisoned for that reason, but the protections were embedded there. So I think this is something where you can't just complain on social media. It's a sustained campaign that you have to take to the courts, that you have to take to the Puigdemont, that has to be really met everywhere.
Yes, but I think that, of course, it's unbearable. But the most unbearable thing that it will exist till people will keep silent.
But
people who know that,
as long
as people will keep silent, they know that. They know, and they keep silent.
This whole social media thing, it tends to create a huge tsunami of interest, and then we see the social media move on. They move on to something else.
Maybe, but at the moment, you cannot deny that being an official feminist, a lot of people come to me about feminist issues, and you can imagine that for the past 3 weeks, a lot of people came to me, and you wouldn't guess the number of people my age, guys, coming to me and saying, "Really?" And I was like, "What do you mean?
Guys are stupid. What can you say?
Were you blind?" But the thing is, though, that from this point on, they know, though. Have you seen the number of them pledging on the social medias that from now on, if they are in the subway, they won't stay silent anymore?
I'm really sorry. We're going to have to end the conversation here. No doubt it's going to continue in the corridors beyond this studio, but it's time now for Media Watch. It's time now to take a look at what's been buzzing online with Catalan. Hello.
Hi, Annette.
And continuing on that feminist front, you've been looking at a Twitter hashtag condemning the gender pay gap.
That's right, because as of today, November the 3rd at 11:44, women essentially are working for free. That's according to the calculations made in the gender...
I think we need to all drop our mics.
There's actually been a Twitter movement encouraging women to symbolically walk off the job. And on Twitter, this hashtag 3rd of November, 11:44 has been set up to sort of rally women around the cause of the gender pay gap, which in France is still very prevalent. It hovers around 15%. And what's even worse is that this year it's 4 days earlier than last year. Last year, that gender pay gap started, women started working for free on November the 7th. This year, it's November the 3rd. So clearly, for many people, it's regressing. The problem, or at least progress, is not being done. And I just want to show you a few tweets. This person has tweeted posters. Here is the subtitle says, this woman, everything changed for this woman, for this doctor, when she realized that she was operating for free, while other people have been tweeting things like, this is not okay.
OK, let's stick with Twitter for the next story, which has also gone viral today. A former Twitter employee having stuck it to Donald Trump, using that very Australian phrase there, Dipti, on his last day of work.
That's right. To be honest, everyone has had a little bit of fun with this story. Donald Trump may have the nuclear codes, but one departing Twitter employee hit him where it hurts the hardest, hit him where it hurts the most, his Twitter account. The rogue staffer on his or her last day, we're not sure who it is, essentially shut down his Twitter account for about 11 minutes, and it's provoked a lot of praise online. This person has crossed out sorry and put in you're welcome. That page doesn't exist. Other people have been tweeting GIFs. This woman walking off the job in a blaze of fire to emulate this heroic, quote-unquote, heroic Twitter employee. This person says he's saving a picture of this real Donald Trump's account that doesn't exist anymore as proof that anything can happen no matter how big you are in the world. And finally, this Twitter user says, well, he was terrified that Donald Trump might have been using those 11 minutes to actually do work and pass legislation.
OK, very briefly, let's talk about the story that much of the press have been reporting on. A man in Germany having called police over what was a rather unusual finding in his garden. You're going to have to be very quick with this one.
That's right. It was this. He thought it was a World War II bomb. He called the bomb disposal police. It did turn out that it was actually a very old zucchini or courgette, depending on what you call it. It weighed 5 kilos, and police say it actually did look like a bomb. As this Twitter user says, well, I guess you can never really be too careful, can you?
We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Dipti. I want to thank my guests. And that's it for this edition of The World This Week. Do stay with us here on France 24 as my colleagues will be coming up at the top of the hour with more news and headlines.